Hi everyone, my name is Hayden and today we're going to be learning about ReactJS routing and single page apps. The essence of this lecture is trying to solve a problem that you might have come across so far, which is how exactly do I have a multi-page website? Because when you think of a website, you probably think of something where when you navigate there, and let me just use UNSW as an example, you've got a URL and then you've got another page and all these different things, they change what's in the URL. In this case it's a little bit different, but you see here /researcher, and then when you click on someone's name you get /something else. So how do we solve for that, where we can create a React app that essentially has kind of like a different page for those different sections? And the answer to that is we're going to look at a particular ReactJS library, which is called React Router DOM. It's a very popular library and is pretty much the standard one used with ReactJS. And the purpose of it is to allow us to associate particular components, as in ReactJS components, with particular URL routes. It's able to let us link between routes without requiring a full refresh. This is something that kind of classical websites, even like the UNSW site, don't do. You'll notice that every time I click on a new link, the page does a full refresh. You can tell because of this little loading bar up here up the top. So that whole page is being refreshed every single time. You can see it doing that. So that's the second thing. Because sure, we can build things to just be on different pages, but how do we link to them without causing that refresh? Then the third thing is, how do we capture wildcards in the URL and load things dynamically? And a really good example of this, right, would be pages like this one, where we have, say, all these different events, and all these different events have different URLs, but these pages would be generated dynamically, right? Someone out there doesn't have a single React.js component for every single event, right? They don't have like a whole separate file. They have one file that takes in the same-ish URL, but with different strings. So how do we capture that information and dynamically render the page? They're the three questions we want to answer, and we're going to answer them by using the React Router DOM library. So what I've done just to prepare this lecture is I've gone and run create React app to generate a new React app here. I've got it right here, and what I'm going to be doing is loading these files up, installing React Router DOM, and showing you what we can do with it. So here I've got a folder called React Routing SPAs, and inside that folder you can actually see that I've got my basic React app here. So what I'm going to do is, well, let me change the syntax just so that, it looks okay. What I'm going to be doing here, React, is I'm going to start up this React app so that we can start fiddling with it. That's going to open up a new app in the browser here, and now we want to try and create a couple of pages. So how would we create a couple of those pages? Well, let's start simple. Let's try and create, for instance, for us just a home page and an about page and maybe a profile page, right? And we'll try and expand this idea where profile pages can be multiple different people's profiles. So the first thing we're going to do when we work with React Router DOM is I would usually recommend that you go to their website. Now, this library may be superseded in a year or 2 or 3 by another type of dependency, but at the moment it's pretty strong, right? It's doing 7 million downloads a week. So there's a getting started guide, which you can find here, and they'll usually tell you, you have to, create your React app. This is for a tutorial, but then they'll also tell you kind of what to install. So here I can see the npm module that I would like to install, which is React Router DOM. Now, one thing that's tricky at the time of this recording in early 2022 is that React Router DOM is currently at version 6, and that version was a massive upgrade from the previous version, version 5. So you have to be very careful about this, because coding in version 6 is very different for what you were doing in previous versions. So I'm going to go and stop my React app. Gonna install React Router DOM. I don't think you need the @6. I think it will install version 6. Then I'll start up my React app again. Great. And then I'll load it up, and now we can actually, start using it. So let's have a look. Let's scroll through here and let's look for something that's interesting. This is what you're looking for. So here is kind of your main page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and get rid of all of this stuff here, all of the default things, and I'm going to copy and paste from here this browser router. So if you remember back to what I wrote on the very short lecture notes, you remember that I said the first thing we're trying to do is associate particular components with particular routes. So what I mean by that is that what I want to be able to say here, and let me just make this a bit bigger so you can see it under my head, is that I want to be able to say, well, the default route here should take me to a particular component. And then I want another route, which I might say is like /about, to take me to another component. And then I can create another route called /profile, which I want to take me to another component. So now what I can do here is like go and define those three components up the top. Now normally you might go define these in separate files, but just to keep things really simple to start, I'll define them all up the top. I might call this component here home, this component here profile. Obviously, if you haven't seen the components and props lecture, that's kind of a prerequisite here. And now I'll go and start creating those components. So I say, well, my home component, it can just return div home. So let's keep these components really simple just to demonstrate the principles. I'll have my second component here, which can be about, which can just return about. And then I'll have my third component, which can be profile, which can show profile there. Now, when I go back here, you'll see that it's got a colon. It's going to complain about something not being implemented once I fix up a couple of my syntax errors. It says all these things aren't defined, and that makes sense because these three types, browser router, routes, and route, are all defined in the React Router DOM library. So I have to import those three things. Now this will make my page work now. So you can see here I've got home. So what's actually happening here is that this main component in React is loading, but this browser router component is able to figure out what to render. And it will look through all of the routes here and decide what to render. And because this is / is in the default URL, it's rendering home. But if I navigate to /about, you can see the page is still about, and if I navigate to /profile, I now get this on profile. Now, where this stuff gets a little bit more interesting is how to link between those pages. So what happens if you want to have some kind of common header bar, for instance, right? I want to have some header bar up the top. Well, let's try and make one. What you don't want to do is put any components inside this browser router tag. Everything inside of here is essentially React Router DOM structure. If you want to create a component that goes above all of these things, well, you can do that a few ways. One way is you could go and create a component inside all of these so that each of these home, about, and profile components all have like a nav bar, like using a proper compositional approach. But that sounds like we have to write the same thing out a few times. So maybe let's try another approach. Let's try and actually just put a nav bar element here, right? I'll just call this nav, and let's see if it renders on the page. So before I actually figure out what I want to render on my page, I can have an approach like that. So now what you can see in terms of how this works is that React is just simply loading this component, and all the browser router is doing is choosing which of these to render and which of these to not. So it's essentially like a conditional rendering mechanism. So this is always rendering because it's in all of them. Now I mentioned that you could actually take this, like, in fact, I'll break this out into another component for you called nav. I'll just go and break this out here. I mentioned before too that instead of putting nav, say, in your main app like this, that you could actually go and put it inside of these three components, right? So I could actually do something like this, nav. And I could remove it here. And now it's going to be inside all three components. You might be thinking, oh, this seems like a worse solution because I am repeating myself now. That is partially true, but the advantage of this approach is that now each component is able to decide whether it wants to render the nav or not. And this is particularly useful when dealing with things like auth or pages that simply just don't always display things. A really good example of this is on the course website. We have certain pages that display this subnav component at the top here, like lecture content and tutorials and assignments and resources and well, not installation, but some pages don't have it. So rather than put that subnav bar inside of all of these all of the page components, or putting it up the top of the browser router, we just put it in some of the components, which is just like a nicer way to program. And in some ways, this is kind of clearer to people, right? This is kind of like your ideal way where each component is just composed of other components so that a programmer can really see what makes up that page. But obviously repeating yourself if you're going to do it always is kind of bad. So we would take that out here and leave this nav component in here. Now, that was part one. We'll kind of touch back on that at the end. Part two here was how do we link between routes without requiring a full refresh? Well, let's say this is actually a nav component, and that nav component is going to consist of the different parts of the site. So maybe what I'll do is I'll separate the nav from the rest of the page with a horizontal line, and then I'm going to replace these divs with spans, and then what I'm going to do is I am going to put in the 3 links here. So I'll say home and about and profile, and I want these to be links. And I'll go and put some line between here, so... Oh, I need to put that in a... That's funny, that interpreted it like an OR statement, I guess. There you go. So I got home and about and profile. Now maybe I want a little bit of extra space between all these, so I'll add a HTML entity. You can go and look those up if you want to. That gives things a little bit of breathing room. MBSP means, I don't even remember what it means, but it means space. And now what I want to do is link these things. And then you might be thinking, oh, okay, well, to link it, I'll just use, you know, ahref equals / like that. And then this one here is for about, so it'll be like / about, and then this one here is for profile, / profile, like this. Okay. The problem with this is that whilst you are redirecting, if you pay attention to this little icon all up in the top left here, you'll notice that it's kind of flashing quickly, and that flashing is indicating that that page is actually doing a full reload, and that's not ideal. That's not what we want. We want it to be more seamless than that. Now, if this page was bigger, you would notice the full reload, just like the UNSW page, but in this instance, you're not noticing it. So how we get around this is there's actually a component as part of the React Router DOM library called link. Link is a ReactJS component, and what it does is that it replaces the A component. So it's, you know, open A, end A. And instead of href, the attribute is called to, which makes sense. It's like link to this route. And what this does is this doesn't tell the browser to go and reload a full resource, a web page. It simply works within the React framework to re-render parts of the page. So if I now go and run this, what have I done wrong? Hopefully it'll give me an error. Not too sure. Very strange. Let me just pause and... So a small detail I forgot, and I found it by looking up the console, right? What is going on here is that the way React Router DOM works is that it only likes doing React Router DOM stuff within the browser router. So this is problematic because what it's saying is that the links here, the link tags, exist within the nav component, but the nav component does not exist within the browser router component. Basically, React Router DOM doesn't want to do anything outside of the browser router component. So therefore you think, oh, that's fine, I'll just come and drag this in here. That should solve the problem, right? This becomes pretty effective in the sense that now we can actually do the linking inside of it. So before what we had was we had this up here, which is bad. It's weird that it doesn't display a page error, but it is in the console. Whereas this one is better because it's within browser router. What you can't do is you can't put it within routes. If you put it within routes, React Router DOM gets angry again because it only expects a route tag to be inside of routes. So now we've got our nav here, and you'll notice when I click through this, the page isn't refreshing. It's very seamless. In fact, the virtual DOM is not even re-rendering this line here. It's leaving this line alone because React's very smart in only re-rendering what it needs to, right? So this is good news for us. We've now made a simple page where you can link between components like that. You'll also see that if I refresh the whole page, it stays on this because when you refresh a browser page, it just stays on the URL you're on. So that's number 2, linking between routes without requiring a full refresh. The third thing we said we'd look at is how do we capture wildcards in the URL to utilize state. Now what I mean by that is what happens if I want to have a URL that's like profile/Hayden or profile/Emily or something like this. Now the reason this isn't working right now, the reason literally nothing is rendering is because React Router DOM's browser router routes, this stuff here, looks for an exact match. So because this is /profile/Emily, it's like, that doesn't exist. It doesn't care that it's /profile. What it's looking for is something like /profile/Emily. That works. Now this is also an important lesson that a lot of these routing libraries are able to reuse components. So here I can say that both /profile and /profile/Emily both take you to the profile component. So that's good knowing that we can reuse those things like that. Now, we don't want to have to write out one of these for every single thing, right? But let's start there. I've got my /profile/Hayden, /profile/Emily. They all load the profile component. How we would then make this more dynamic is we would have our profile component and it would like look at the URL and try and parse out the name, and that gets really messy really quickly. Thankfully, React Router DOM is smart enough to give us a wildcard in the URL where I can use :name. So the colon indicates a wildcard and the name is just the name of that wildcard. So what this really means to React Router DOM is /profile/something like that, right? So that's super handy because now, even though when I refresh this page, no matter what name I put here, Hayden hello, it's always loading that component because it's like, well, /profile/something. Well, that's what we have here. It's /profile/something. But the next question is, how do we actually capture that information? This is where a really useful React Router DOM hook comes in, which is the useParams hook. And what useParam, I'll show you how useParams is used. So this profile thing here is a page. And what I can do in this React component, and I'll just expand this out a little bit so we have a bit more breathing room. How we can use this one is that inside that component, I can say const params equals useParams hook like this, and then I will say console.log params, and let's have a look at what the output is. So if I load up F12 here, I can see that params is an object that has a key name and as hello. If I change this to Hayden, its key is Hayden, and you think, oh, this is quite interesting because now what I can do is I can actually just say profile params.name. And now this page will render whatever is here. Profile Emily, profile Hayden, profile hello. And you might be thinking, what's the point of this? It's like, well, typically how this would actually work on a computer is you would use this to make a fetch, and that you would give that fetch to a backend, and that backend would return you the information you want. That's what's happening on a site here like UNSW's when you load all of these events, right? Is it's just passing this Grace Tame information to the backend and loading that information forward. So that's super handy. That's super nice. What happens if someone doesn't enter a name? Does that component still load? Yes, you can see that because it comes up there. However, there's no name. So what might we do? We might want to say something like, please enter a name. So let's do that quickly. I've got my profile component, and what I'll do here is I'll do some conditional rendering, and I'll say if params.name is blank, I don't know, let's try it out. No name, maybe it's blank, maybe it's null, don't know, try it out. Okay, it doesn't seem to be blank, maybe we'll try the undefined case, i.e. if it doesn't exist. No name, great. So if there is no parameter name, maybe let's like render a little short subcomponent. And that subcomponent might do something as simple as store an input. And that input, you know, I can do an input like this. And when someone types it in, and then we can put a button, say button go, and that will take you to a particular page. Now I'm just expanding on this very briefly so that you can kind of see how this goes. So what I can do here is I can make a little version of the component that's simply going to you know, its value is going to be name, and its on change will be e dot set name, e dot target dot value like this, which is probably a bug there. Let me just word wrap this page. And now I go use my use state hook, right? So I'll just say, const name set name equals react.useState null or empty string or something like this, right? And now I've got this little component that should be able to update. Now it's complaining here because React's not defined because I didn't import React, so I need to import React from React here, like that. And now I should be able to type into it, and when I click go, nothing's going to happen because my button's not doing anything. But React's really easy. I could say, well, on click, I want you to do something. I want you to go to a particular route. Now, the old school way of doing this is you could say that, well, I'm going to call a function, and that function is just going to set the window location href to say /profile / name, like this. And that'll send you to the right page. If I do that, I type hello, and I click go, it'll send me to the hello profile. And if I click back to profile, I can go to the Hayden profile. The problem with this is that I'm using window.location.href, which is actually reloading the whole page. And again, you can see this if you watch the little green icon up the top with hello. Refreshes that whole page. So whilst this, as I said, whilst this does work, it's just not perfect. How we actually do it within the React framework is that there's another React router DOM hook called use navigate. And what use navigate does is you can collect it in a variable like this, use navigate, and instead of letting window.location.href equal something, you can actually just call navigate and give it that URL, and it will do all of the smart rerouting for you. So now when I type in Hayden, it sends me to that page, but it did not refresh everything. Now that's really exciting and cool because now we have a way to do this, and this will pay dividends for you on much more complex pages where you don't want to re-render lots of stuff. Now, that kind of summarizes the third item here about capturing wildcards in the URL to utilize state. But I just want to quickly come back to this associate particular components with particular routes, because the new version of React Router, what it allows you to do is it actually allows you to nest routes if you'd like to. What I mean by that is, let's say we, for instance, have another page called about/team. Then we'll create another page called about/ I don't know, history or something like this, right? And what we want to do in each of these cases is we want to link to a particular page. I'll just kind of quickly copy and paste these components. I'll call one about, I'll call another one about team. I'll call another one about history, like this. I'll go and change the components that these things are linking to. Oops. Yeah, sorry, I needed to add them to the nav anyway. So I'll go and create an about team and about history. And I'll go and update this to be about team and about history, like this. And now you can see I've got all these different URLs, and it is sending it to different places, right? However, you can actually clean up your React Router DOM in the v6 by saying, actually, you know what? All of these different abouts are actually all kind of subsets of each other. So instead of this being a void component, I'm actually going to treat this like an open-close component. And then inside of that, I'm going to go and put these two routes. And because it's inside of /about, I can actually get rid of that. So it's a little bit interesting, but oops, I've done something wrong there. Let me just fix that up. See if this works. No. Let me just get rid of that. So you see this isn't actually matching here, and that's because I've definitely done something wrong without realizing. But you can see that about is matching, right? Now, what has gone wrong here, and I've made this mistake in the past, is that while this is a really cool feature of React Router DOM, it doesn't always behave exactly how you might expect. So for instance, what this is saying here is not that if it's /about, go and load about, and then if it's /about/team, go and load about team. This is actually saying if it's /about/anything, we're going to load about, and then inside of that, we're going to load one of these other components. So it's actually built hierarchical. And why this is really tricky is there's actually a, I think it's called outlet. I should double check that, but there's another component of React Router DOM called outlet. And what happens is if you have a component like about that has sub pages, you actually need to include that as a component inside of your code. And this might be a little bit confusing, but what's actually happening here is outlet is kind of like this placeholder used by React Router DOM that simply says, you know what, if there's any sub pages, put them here. so that when I go and load history and team and normal about, if there is a subpage, it goes and loads it there. So that's why you see that both about and about team are being loaded in this particular case. So this is actually something that's really powerful. If you don't want that behavior and you want all these pages to share the same URL, same base URLs, but not have any common code, there's a few different things you can do. Obviously, you can just go and write out all the URLs separately. You could go and create an about component that simply has nothing in it except an outlet, like this. It's just like an empty component. That's another way you can do it, but you can play around with that as you'd like. But that's the basics of using React Router DOM. And just to recap, now we're able to associate components with particular routes. Typically, you will put these in separate pages, like separate files. Usually, I'll create a page folder for these. I'll go and say new folder called page, and then I'll go and move some of those across. I just have to close my editor and reopen it. It doesn't do file history well. I'll go and create a new page, and I'll go and grab this, and I'll put this in a new file, and I'll call this the about page, and then I'll import it here inside of app.js. You know how to do components by this point, so you get the idea, right? But this has just been keeping it simple in one file for the example. But yeah, normally you would break it up. So anyway, hope that helps you gain some confidence in building multi-route pages, not only linking them to components, being able to move between them, and then also capture those wildcards. So thank you very much.